So I like to title this video the nickel tour of Unity. So gotten to the end of your you've gotten to the end of your Unity basics lecture, and this is the opportunity that I like to take to sort of reacquaint you with Unity. You've probably seen Unity before, you've probably worked with Unity before because you've probably had Intro to Gaming before you took this class. And you sort of got thrown into the deep end in that class with respect to scripting. And so hopefully this is a kinder, gentler introduction to Unity, but really this is sort of more level setting review material. So let's go ahead and create a new project in Unity. And I'll call this one Nickel Tour. And it will bring up Unity for us. And I'll resize it so that we can maximize our recording area. Very well, and let's just take a quick review on all the different areas that are in the user interface. So I'm using the personal edition of Unity, which means I only have one theme available to me, the light theme. In the commercial version, in the version that you pay for, you can actually change this so that it's darker. So when you go to the labs, that's usually the default in our labs at Richland and in our classrooms. Things are going to look a lot darker than they do on my recordings. So if you're using Community, this is probably what you're seeing just as I am. All right, so we have a couple of panes that are always in here. The first one, and probably the most important one, is the hierarchy. So the hierarchy contains everything that is currently loaded in memory in the scene at any given point in time. So right now we just have a main camera, which you can see here, and a directional light, which is new in Unity 5. They didn't used to put lights in by default, but so many people got confused, especially hopefully new people got confused whenever they would put all this stuff in there. You'd be able to see it in the scene view. You'd hit play and you'd just get a black screen. Well, there are no lights on, so yeah, that's what happens. So if you set up a set in the dark and you turn a camera on, but you don't turn any lights on, you would expect blackness. So to help us out, they've given us this directional light. Now remember, we have a whole course on lighting at Richland College, so we're not going to go in depth into all the different things that you can do with lighting. But suffice to say, directional light is probably the one that we're going to be using most of the time. It's the simplest light, and it really just has a direction. You can see the indicators here showing the direction of the light. And if you take a traditional art class, you learn about drawing shadows and shading based on the position of the light in the room. So this is the same thing here. It's giving you an indication that light is going to be streaming from this direction. Contrast that with if it were a spotlight, this would be exactly just this area would be the part that is being lit. But in this case, what this is telling you, since it looks like a sun, is that the entire scene is going to be lit and the light will appear to come from this direction, top left, moving down. All right, so that's the hierarchy. You have a menu here that will allow you to create objects, and you can create anything that Unity will allow you to create. Unity has the ability to create simple shapes, simple 3D objects, cubes, spheres, cylinders, etc. So we'll put a cube out there just so we have something to look at. And it puts it in the middle. So now that we have something on the hierarchy that isn't the main camera or the cube, it's probably now a good idea to point out this scene tab that we've been looking at but not really announcing. So let's announce it. This is the scene tab, and this is where you build all of your scene, your set, if you will. If you were making a play or you're making a movie, you would have a set for your movie, and this is what you're looking at here. So this is where you actually build your levels, your games. All of the visible components can be positioned and imported and placed and otherwise worked with in the scene view. You also up here have something called the game view, and when you click the game view tab, you're going to see this as the camera sees it. So you need to have at least one camera in your scene at all times. Otherwise, you're building a set that no one will see, which is akin to a tree falling in the woods and no one is there to hear it. If you make a scene, you could put all the most beautiful things in the world in your scene, but without a camera, no one's going to be able to see any of it. So we have our camera in our scene. We got that when we created the project, and we've got our cube, and now that's the only thing that's in there. Now you'll note that there's a big difference between what the camera's looking at. The camera's looking at it almost level and sort of face on, and we're looking at it sort of at an opposite view. And you can see that it makes sense because that's the camera, and these lines are the frustum of the camera, the area that it's actually viewing. And yet we are looking at the camera as though we were separate from the camera, and we are. So we can move around in Unity by using the mouse roller wheel on your mouse. There's a roller wheel in the middle, or there's a middle mouse button depending on how old your mouse is. And the middle mouse button, if you click on that, allows you to pan. Your right mouse button allows you to swing the camera around. And when I say the camera, I'm talking about your point of view, not the camera for the scene. This is the scene camera, and you can see that what it is seeing right here is stationary regardless of how we move our viewport. So this is for us as editors to be able to come in here and move things around and to be able to swing around. And you can use your mouse roller wheel to zoom in and out. You can swing around with the right mouse button, and you can move up and down like so. And so that's useful for getting around. Another thing that you can do, let's say you've zoomed really far out like so, and you're confused, you want to go to the cube, you can double click the cube and it will take you right to it. Likewise, let me do that again. I'm just going to roll my mouse wheel out until I am lost again. I can click something in the hierarchy, and with my mouse positioned over the viewport, I can press F, and it will take me to it there as well. F for focus. So if you want to focus on a particular object, you can select it, press F, and it will focus that in the scene for you. The other thing that we have to work with is up here. These are called gizmos, and this particular gizmo allows us to change our point of view. So we have, right now we've got this free perspective. We can move around and move this however we'd like. But let's say that we want to position something so that it's lined up along one of the axes. Well, if I click X, it's going to move me to the X axis and just focus on that. And again, I can use my center mouse wheel, the button on it, to move up and down. And you got this nice little hand. This is sort of like taking a piece of paper and moving it up and down with your hand. And so you can move it around like that. Position things however you'd like. You can click one of the other axes. For example, you can click Y, and now I'm looking down at it. I can click Z, and I'm looking at it from the Z perspective. And then when you're ready to switch back, what you can do is you can right-click this cube in the middle and select free again, and that will take you back to it. Now, before I do that, well, I'll go ahead and do that, and I'll show you the other thing that you can do with this particular gizmo. See how down here it says PERSP for perspective? You can also click this, and it will change it to isomorphic. Now, isomorphic is going to take out all of the visual cues for depth perception. So if you're doing a top-down or a side scroller or something like that that doesn't require depth perception, then you can turn that off, and all of the camera's computations that make it appear three-dimensional are going to go away. And sometimes that's helpful. So that's isomorphic view. Switch it back to perspective, and you're going to get your foreshortening, and all of those other depth cue effects are going to come back. All right, as for these other two tabs that are up here, you can leave those for later. Those may not even be in your editor. Those are just things that I happen to use often, and so they're here. But you can get to things if you can't find them. You usually can go into Window and find what you're looking for here. For example, if we wanted to go to the asset store, I don't have a tab up for that right now. If I wanted to go to the asset store, I could select Window and click Asset Store, and now I've got a tab for Asset Store. And you can dock these things. So for example, if I wanted to put this up here, I can drag this and I can dock it in here like so. And now I've got a tab up here for the asset store. So if I need to jump over there for something, I can just go asset store and I can do my thing, and it's right there as part of what we're working on. So that's kind of handy. And you can do that for anything. You can move the project around. Maybe you like your project over here next to your hierarchy, so I can move that over there. Let's say maybe I like these in a different order. I can reorder my tabs like that, and you can set this up however you would like. There are a couple of presets for this though. So if you find yourself constantly changing your layouts, you can come over here to this layout drop down and you can change your layout. Usually this affects mostly the viewport more than anything else. So let's take a look. Let's say you're used to your usual 4 split view that we used to always use in our 3D tools. If I select that, now I've got a layout where I've got the top, the left, the right, and then a perspective view all in different viewports. And in order to make that happen, it's gone ahead and rearranged everything else. So there's different things that you can set to. 2x3 will give you 2 views, and then all of your stuff over here. You can switch to tall, which basically bundles everything over here and makes the viewport as wide as it can. Likewise, wide will do the same thing, but it will maximize the width. And that's pretty close to what we started off with. And you can always get back to default by clicking the default tab. And this is what Unity ships with out of the box. If you fiddle around with all of this and you get something that you really like, you have the ability to save the layout as well as delete layouts that you may not use anymore. So maybe you have a project where you need a particular layout. You can save one, and then when the project is over, maybe you want to free up some space in your list, then you can delete layout. And there's always revert factory settings, which basically takes everything back to what it was when you installed Unity. Okay, so those are all the tabs that appear up here, and we've talked about the hierarchy. So let's keep moving to the right. I'm going to select the cube. You'll note that we have this inspector tab over here, but nothing is in it. So the thing about the inspector tab is that it changes depending on what you have selected. And so I'll select a cube in the hierarchy, and you can see now that my inspector tab sort of springs to life. So this allows me to change aspects of whatever I have selected. In this case, I have a transform, which is going to be on everything that you have in the hierarchy, regardless of what it is. And then beyond that, you're going to have different things depending on what it is. So for our cube, we have this mesh filter, and we have a mesh renderer, and we even have a collider that got put on there automatically when we created it. But this is going to be a different set if I select, for example, the directional light. The directional light has a different set of parameters in here that I can change and edit, but it does have the base transform. Everything you'll find has this basic transform in it. Likewise with the main camera, it too will have the transform, which consists of the position, rotation, and scale, but after that, all of the things are going to be specific to whatever it is that you've selected. So your inspector is going to change depending on what is selected. Let me go back to my cube. And note that there are a lot of things that you can do with this. You're going to spend a lot of time over here in the inspector. So the first thing you might want to do is you might want to rename this from cube to something else, like, I don't know, maybe we'll call it floor and make it into a floor here in a minute. So when I change that here, you'll note that it changes what it says over here in the hierarchy. And the hierarchy by default is usually more or less, well, traditionally, I'll just say traditionally it's been alphabetical. In Unity 5, I think was the first time we could, maybe it was 4.6, we were actually able to change the order of things in our hierarchy. So main camera and directional light at the top, obviously not alphabetic anymore. You can, if there's something you're going to be using all the time, for example, if we had a character in here, maybe that's the player character, we can actually move these around. So we can move that one to the top if that's something we're going to be dealing with all the time. And so that's pretty nice. All right, going back to our inspector, whatever you click on is going to appear over here in the inspector with all of its specific settings. And we saw just now how to change this. We can technically disable this as well. So if we click this checkbox right here, you'll notice that it goes away. It's not there anymore. And in the hierarchy, if I click off of it, you'll notice that it's considerably lighter. So as far as Unity is concerned at this point, this object is pretty much disabled. It's not going to show up. You're not going to be able to interact with it. You're not going to be able to do anything to it until you actually turn it back on again. And this can sometimes be handy if you've got a whole bunch of things in your scene and you just want to focus on some of the details. You can turn some of the stuff off that you don't need to deal with, and then you can always turn this back on again later when you're ready to start dealing with those objects again. You'll note that this turns off the entire cube. So when I turn this off, the whole cube is off. I turn it back on, the whole cube is on. And you have these checkboxes on the individual components. So those only deal with those components. For example, if I want to turn off the box collider, I can, and you'll note that there's a green line around this. If I zoom in on a little bit, you can see there's a green line. That's the collider. If I turn the collider off, I won't see that green line anymore. I'll turn it back on again, and now you can see it. And if you leave it off, it's almost the same as though it weren't there. Likewise with the mesh renderer, if you turn the mesh renderer off, you're not going to be able to see the cube because that's the component that makes the cube appear. If I turn that off, now all I see is the box collider, and that sometimes comes in handy. If you want to make a barrier that your player can't pass, we'll do this in an exercise later, you can just turn off the mesh renderer and leave the collider on if you'd like. So that's a nice little trick. I'll turn the mesh renderer back on, and now we have access to seeing the cube again, and that's really what the mesh renderer is doing for us. All right, so we're going to do a lot more with the inspector as we move through the course. Just know that it is specific to what you're clicking on, and whatever you have selected is what you can use to manipulate. You'll use the inspector to manipulate that object, add things to it, add components, take components off, and change different aspects of each component. All right, so the next stop on our nickel tour, let me actually size this up a little bit so you can see the bottom of my screen. Earlier when we were switching layouts, it changed where my bottom was. So I want you to be able to see the bottom. So this is the bottom of Unity here. And in order to keep it within 1080p, I actually have a little bit of room down here at the bottom. You can't see the bottom of my screen. So if you're confused, that's what's going on. So I just moved this up so you can see the bottom of the Unity screen because we have a few things down here that are going to be important to us. So right now we don't have any assets in here or anything like that. So why don't we go ahead and bring some assets in? So as promised, why don't we turn this into a floor? We already named it floor. Why don't we make it into something that looks like a floor? I've selected it. It's ready to be manipulated. If we come up to the top here, you'll see that there are these buttons here. And these allow us to do somewhat obvious transformations to this. So if I click the hand, this is the same as if I were holding down my middle mouse button and moving the viewport around. So that's just a viewport manipulation. But the rest of these will actually manipulate the object that you have currently selected. So the first one is transform. And the transform allows you to move something. So if you're going to move it within the 3D space, then you can. Now, if you take a quick look at your transform here, you can see the position is 0, 0, 0. And this is sort of, it puts it in the middle of our 3D operating space, which is theoretically infinite. So you can go off in any direction and theoretically never reach the end. Of course, you eventually will reach the end depending on how much memory your computer has, but for all intents and purposes, you can go off in any direction. And the numbers that you will see in here are going to be decimal numbers, fractional numbers. So as I change the position of the cube with the transform, you'll see that things change in our position. Now, my monitor is a two-dimensional monitor, and so you'll see that only two of the numbers are changing, the y coordinate and the z coordinate. And this is just because I have selected the middle part of this box. So when you select the middle part of this box here, you can do anything that you want to it. More than likely, what you really want to do is you want to move things in one direction at a time. So I've kind of messed around with this. I just really want to reset it to the way it was. Let me do that. I'm going to click the gear here. The gear is going to have the drop-down menu in it that has different options depending on the component that you're working with. In this case, I'm going to reset the transform, and I'm going to reset all of it. I'm going to hit reset. Now, I could hit reset position. I haven't done anything else to it yet, so reset position would do the same thing. I'm just going to hit reset, and that takes it back to where it was in the beginning. So you can see that the cube is back to 0, 0, 0, and you can see that if I had resized it, it would have put it back. So everything is 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. And a meter, each one of these squares represents a meter at this stage. The default unit of measure is meters in Unity. That's a lovely question on one of your exams. So there's your first, or possibly your first, bingo answer, depending on if you're playing bingo and if you're watching the tutorials in order. All right, so we've got this back where it started. And so let's take a look at the next transformation tool. If I come up here and click this one, this is rotation. So what this will let me do is it will let me rotate around the various axes. And again, if I just click anywhere on this cube, I can sort of free rotate it however I would like. So that's sometimes fun, but usually you're going to want to rotate it around a specific axis. So what I can do in this case is I can drag the axes, and they're color coded. So red is going to be X, and green is going to be Y, and blue is going to be Z. And I'm teaching out of the United States, so I say Z and not Z. If you watch tutorials coming out of Canada or Europe, they will say Z instead of Z. Okay, so that's nice. That lets you rotate around a single axis, but this is kind of weird, right? Because those axes don't look natural. So let's go back. Let's reset this to what it was when we put it out there. And that still looks strange to me. There are axes that you can deal with separately. So why don't we see how to do that? You have these two buttons here that say center and global. So why don't we change global to local? And when I click global to local, now the axes look normal. So now when I'm moving it around the y-axis, it's moving it around this y-axis here. You can see that y is up, and so now I'm spinning it around the y-axis. Z is one of the vertical axes, and now I'm rotating it along the z-axis, and X is the other vertical axis, and so I can rotate it around that. So when I switched from global to local coordinates, the X, Y, and Z coordinates are taken into account just for the object. When it's back on global, now we're talking about X, Y, and Z for the entire world that we're sitting in. And so sometimes it's very handy to be able to select local, switch it from global to local, and now we can move and change things according to the coordinate space for just the object that we're working with. I'll go ahead and reset this one more time so we can take a look at the last one. I know it's not really the last one, you have that, but that's something else. So this is the one we actually want to use when we're going to make our floor. So this is the resize, and as usual, I can click the square in the middle and I can resize the whole thing. Or, let me reset it, I can grab individual axes, and that's what I'm going to do to make my floor. So I'm going to stretch this out in sort of the horizontal directions, and then I'll scale out a little bit. I've got all this height that I really don't care about, so let me squish it down. And I don't want to squish it down to nothing. I want there to be some space in there. And that looks good. And now I usually like to come over here and see what my numbers turned out to be. So I put just shy of 19, and then 2 for my height, and then 20 for my other one. So I usually like to come in here and change these up. So why don't we just make it 20 by 20 by 2. Sorry, it's 0.2. And that's just a little bit cleaner and predictable. So that's not bad. Now let's add a texture to this. So for the texture, all I'm going to do is I'm just going to go out to the internet and find one. So I've done a search on Google for dungeon floor texture, and there are plenty to choose from. For our exercise, we're not going to publish anything, so I'm just going to grab one and not worry too much about copyright issues. I'm just going to grab a texture and throw it on there. So all you need to do is just save this down. Pick one and save it down. So if I want to use this one, I can just take that and save the image, and then I can go get it. So I've done that already. Let me go and get it. I think I saved it to my desktop. And that's the one that I picked. So that's tileable bricks single. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this and I'm going to drag it and drop it into assets down here at the bottom. So we haven't had anything in assets yet. So let's just change that. Again, I'm just dragging and dropping. I haven't released the mouse yet. I'll go ahead and do that. And as soon as I release it, it will go ahead and it will import it. So now within assets, I have a single graphic, and I can use that graphic as a texture. I can use it a lot of different ways. I can use it in my user interface. I can do lots of things with it. So this is something common that you're going to see when you import assets. If I click the asset down here in assets, my inspector is going to change, but it's going to change for the asset rather than having it within the context of the hierarchy. So your inspector window is actually a multi-use tool. So let's click on the graphic and see what we've got. So when I click on this, I can see that I have some settings here, and this has nothing to do with the hierarchy. This isn't even in the hierarchy. This is for the asset. So when you import assets, you can change things about how that asset was imported. And this is what we're seeing here. So I have a texture type. There's lots of different things that we'll use throughout the course in here. This one actually came in as a texture, and that's actually what I want. So I'm just going to leave that alone. You can make an alpha out of the grayscale version of the graphic, and that's interesting. You generally want to make sure that everything is as you expect it to be here, and once it is, you can click apply. Now if you change the way that the graphic, something about the graphic, and you need to actually see those settings take place, that's why you click apply. And basically what it does is it changes the graphic in Unity, leaving the original alone. So if you change something in here, it's not going to make a change to your original graphic. It's going to make the changes within Unity's structure. So for example, if I made an alpha from the grayscale, that's not going to change the graphic at all, the one that I imported, the one that's on my desktop. That's going to remain unchanged. That's actually a very important thing to remember, because the artists on your team, or you if you're the artist on the team, probably wouldn't be very happy if Unity were making changes to the original graphic file. It doesn't do that. It brings it into its own structure, and then it makes the changes that you make here. And that's also true when we look at 3D models. You can add things and change the way 3D models are somewhat. You can change how they're structured, how they're treated, but that doesn't change the underlying file or the geometry that you used in Maya or Max or Blender or whatever it was that you used. It doesn't change those files at all. Okay, so we've got our asset in here, and we want to apply it to our floor. So really all you have to do to make that happen is just click it and drag it and drop it on there, and that's pretty nice. So let me just position it so that I can see, and what it's done is it's added it as a texture. So I'm going to click the cube, and I can see that it now has a shader on it. It had a shader before, but it was an empty shader. And in order to see this, you really need to open it up. So let's click this triangle right here, and now we can see what's on there. Now probably this is a little big, right? It applied one, just the tile by itself. This is just one rendition of it. We probably want it to be quite a bit smaller than that. So let's come down here to tiling, and let's change it. Oh, that's the wrong one. Sorry. It's this one up here. There's two tiles, there's secondary maps, and then there's the main map. You want the main map. So let's change this to something else. Say, I don't know, 5. And then we'll do the same thing in Y. And now it's basically repeating 5 times in every direction. So there's 25 iterations of this map being drawn. It looks pretty nice now. Whoever made this map did a really great job. All right, so that's how we apply the textures. Now, the one thing you might notice is it exists as a graphic here, but as soon as I dragged it and dropped it onto the object, it created this folder that says materials, and we can actually drill down into that. We can double click it. So there is this thing called a material, and it's applied this graphic as a map. So these are two different things. You can have the graphic and a material, and they're separate things. They use each other, but they're different things. So you're going to see Unity creating things as you go along. So I suppose the next thing that we really want to look at, I'm going to click assets here to go back to the top, is how to change this display, because in my humble opinion, this is not all that useful as a display. If you come down here to the bottom, there's a nice little slider here, and I almost always come over here and just slide this all the way over. And when I do that, it gives me a list, and this is, to me, this is easier to use. And you've got these nice little breadcrumbs here so you can tell where you are. So that's usually one of the first things I do, but you can come in here and change this and alter the size of the thumbnails that you're looking at. And so that's kind of cool. You can also search for assets. You have the ability to find things in here. Not very helpful in this particular project because it's so small, but you can come in here and you can do a search for assets if you've lost them. You can also filter by using different parameters over here. So you can search by type, you can search by labels, you can have favorites, you can do all of that stuff, and that's useful. All right, so let's round out our tour by going to console. That's the last thing on here, and it looks like we've got something strange going on in here. Not really sure what, because we haven't added any scripts to this yet. Sometimes you're going to see these kinds of errors pop up, and these are actually errors that are in Unity itself. Hopefully you don't see too many of them, but they do from time to time pop up, so you should be wary of that. But this is where we can actually see messages coming out of our scripts. So I'll show you that when we actually get into scripting, how you can output messages to the log. This is where you'll see all of your errors and all of your warnings. And you can actually turn various things on and off by using these buttons over here. So if you don't want to see errors, which would be a mistake, you always want to see errors, you can actually turn them off and then turn them back on again. And it's really subtle, so be really careful with this. Look at the visual difference between the two. Right now it's on, and right now it's off. So it's slightly darker, but there isn't really indication that it's turned off. So you may have accidentally turned it off. So I didn't get any errors. Why won't it work? That might be something that you look at. Make sure that you haven't got that checked. All right, so I guess the only other thing left is to actually run our game. We haven't done that yet, and there's not going to be much to it. Let me see. If we go look at the main camera, we can see that we're just sort of level with it, and that's fine. So if I run this, I can see what the camera sees. And that's how you run your game. You'll note that it switched to the game view. You can switch back to the scene view and actually look around, and the game is still running. So if there were anything happening in the game, you can inspect it from the scene view as well as the game view if you'd like. And that, I think, pretty much rounds out our nickel tour of Unity. Again, hopefully this was all review, and naturally we're going to be using the tool quite a bit, so we'll be filling in a lot of gaps and a lot of details as the course progresses.